Okay, so now first, let's go through the steps we're going to follow to complete the square. But after we've done a few examples, I would probably be a good idea for us to go back and review these steps to make sure that we understand and remember the steps we're going to follow. So the first step is, of course, to make sure your quadratic equation is in the general form. Okay? Now, first thing we're going to do, we're going to divide by whatever's in front of the x squared. So every term just gets divided by the a. Okay? And so that's why our perfect square trinomial is only ever going to have a 1x squared. Okay? At the same time, we can also just move our constant term to the other side. The third step is where we make a perfect square trinomial. That's why we are practicing that. And we're going to add a number to both sides, which essentially is adding 0. And then from there, we factor the left, but that's going to factor down to a binomial squared. And then we solve kind of like we were just doing in the simpler examples that we just finished. Okay? All right, let's do a few examples, Risa. So here we are. So what's the first thing we're going to do, Risa?
Divided by 3.
Okay, and at the same time as we divide by 3,
Move to.
right, we're going to move the 2 to the other side. So dividing by 3 and then moving the 2, the constant term, to the other side, we're here. Now, the number in front of x is red because that's where we want to look. Okay, so this number here is going to let us figure out what we're going to add to both sides. And Risa, what are we going to add to both sides?
1.
Very good. And over here, this is what Risa did. She took the number in front of x, she divided it by 2, and she squared it. And she gets 1, so we add 1 to both sides. Now, what does this left-hand side factor to, Risa?
X minus 1.
And,
squared.
oh sorry,
And then
and 2/3 plus 1?
5 over 3.
Okay, good. And now, this is looking familiar like the last examples we were doing. At this point, what do?
Square root.
Very good, taking the square root. Now, on the left-hand side, it's simple enough. The square root and the squared cancel. And then over here, we're going to rationalize the denominator. So this is the same thing as root 5 over root 3. So rationalize that denominator for me, please, Risa. What would we get?
Root 15 over 3.
Very good. And so in the next step, we have this. And again, just remember that we rationalized the denominator on the right-hand side. Now, what are we going to do with this minus 1?
Move to the right side.
Very good. And so we get x is equal to 1 plus or minus root 15 over 3. But at this point, I don't want you to stop here. This isn't a very nice looking answer. And so what we're going to do instead is we're going to make it a single fraction. So what happens to the 1 if we make it a single fraction?
It will be 3.
Right, because 1 is the same thing as 3 over 3, and you have a common denominator. And so our answer is x is equal to 3 plus or minus root 15 over 3. Okay? All right, let's do a couple more. All right, so again, Risa, how do we start these questions?
Divided by 2 and bring 15 over to the right side.
Very good. So dividing by 2 and at the same time moving the constant to the other side. Now, kind of boring. We have the same number in front of x as the previous example. And so we know very quickly, what are we going to add to both sides?
1.
Very good. And again, just remember, whatever's in front of x divided by 2 and then squared. And add that to both sides. And factor the left-hand side and simplify the right-hand side. What do we have, Risa?
X minus 1 squared.
And on the right-hand side?
17 over 2.
Perfect. Okay. And what's next?
Square root.
Taking the square root. And again, we're going to rationalize this denominator. What does that become?
That root 34 over 2.
Perfect. Okay. And moving the 1 to the other side. And then making it a nice looking answer. So making it one fraction, we get x is equal to 2 plus or minus root 34 over 2. All right, let's do an example that doesn't have a 2 in front of the x after we divide by the number in front of x squared. Okay, so let's do our third example. All right, so what do we divide by, Risa?
4.
Okay, and then moving the constant term, the 1 to the other side, we have the following. Now, as I said, it's a difference. So now, what does the 4 tell us?
The square root? No, the sign.
Sorry, that's kind of a bad question. Now that it's a 4, what number are we going to add to both sides?
6, 4.
We're going to add 4. Very good. And again, don't forget, simply 4 divided by 2, which is,
2,
and then squared,
4.
we get 4. Okay, so we know that we add 4 to both sides. And now, back to this perfect square trinomial, Risa.
X minus 2 squared.
And then what about this algebra over here? What's negative 1/4 plus 4?
15 over 4.
Very quick. Good. All right. And now square root. And in this case, we don't have to rationalize our denominator. Why do we not have to rationalize the denominator?
Because it's perfect square.
Very good. The square root of 4 is 2. And so in the end, we have the following. And moving our 2 to the other side. And then, again, making it a single fraction. There's our answers. Okay? Was this easy?
Yeah, kind of.
Kind of? All right. Well, I'm still going to make it much, much harder now. Okay? So let's look at our final example. And this is going to be more difficult because we're going to have fractions. Okay? What are we going to divide everything by?
3.
Okay? And at the same time, we're going to move our minus 6 to the other side. And so we end up with this. Now, again, in this case, our number in front of x is a fraction. But don't worry, it's the same thing. Taking the 5/3, how do we figure out what we're going to add to both sides?
Divided by 2 and then square.
Very good. So just remember, 5/3 divided by 2. Dividing by 2, how do we divide by 2?
To simplify.
Very good. So multiply by a half. So 5/3 times a half is 5/6. Square that. That's where the 25/36 comes from. And so simply add 25/36 to both sides. Now, what does this factor down to, Risa?
X plus 5 over 6.
Perfect. X plus 5 over 6. And then a little bit of math over here, we're going to get 97 over 36. So let's take a look at that. All right, now, very quickly, I just want to review how we can factor this down to this. It's really simple again, remember, the square root of x squared gives us the x. The square root of 25/36 gives us the 5/6. And the sign of our middle term gives us the sign in the binomial. Okay, so it's really easy. Okay, and you also recognize that this 5/6 was here before we squared it. Okay, so another way of getting this number is just to remember that you had 5/6 here before you squared it. At this point, Risa, what do we do?
Square root.
Very good. And what's the square root of 36?
6.
Okay, and so the next step here, we're going to simply have this. And now we're going to move the 5/6 to the other side. And our answer will be this because they already have a common denominator. Okay? All right, so what do you think, Risa? Can you complete the square?
Yes.
Yes, and why don't you give the button a push?
Yeah.
That was easy.
All right, do your homework, kids. See ya.